Okay, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Samuel Pang. I introduced myself earlier at the main session. I work at Boston IVF in Boston, Massachusetts. What I'd like to do here is spend just a few minutes telling you a little bit about what I do and the history of what I've done in helping gay men become genetic parents. And then I will open it up for questions, and I would be more than happy to address any questions that anybody has. So I am a physician, a reproductive endocrinologist, so I provide the medical services. I do not provide surrogates or legal counseling or egg donor matches. I provide the medical services, which is the IVF and the embryo transfer. So the very first time, how I got into this was that the technology that we have, which is in vitro fertilization, has been used to help infertile heterosexual couples have children, but there are some women who cannot get pregnant with their own eggs, and so we use egg donors to help them. There are other women who cannot carry a pregnancy, so we use a surrogate to help them. And then in 1998 was the very first time I was approached by a gay male couple who wanted to put those two pieces together using an egg donor and a surrogate to help them have children. And that's when I started treating gay male couples. It's been a little over 20 years now. I've treated many dozens of male couples that way, and many have been successful. In my experience, virtually all of the patients that I've treated have been successful in having at least one baby. I've had some who've had as many as 3 by choice. In my entire experience in the 21 years that I've been doing this, there's been one couple who was never successful, but they only tried once. When they were not successful, they gave up, so they didn't try a second time. There's the majority, I would say well over 75%, are successful the first time, and then the rest are successful, if they weren't successful the first time, either successful with a second attempt or with a frozen embryo transfer. And I've only ever had one male couple who required a third attempt in order to have their baby. So because we use young, healthy egg donors and we use young, healthy gestational surrogates, it's usually a very, very successful process. I think that's one of the messages that I want to give to you. In terms of the strategy, historically, 20 years ago, what we used to do was create embryos in 2 cohorts. We would have an egg donor provide eggs. We would inseminate eggs. Half the eggs with sperm from one of the men, half the eggs with sperm from the other man, and then we would transfer one embryo from each of the 2 cohorts into the surrogate. Some people would get pregnant with twins, and so that way the intended parents each have a genetic child from the same egg donor. Sometimes what would happen is they would get pregnant with just one baby, even though we transferred 2 embryos, and then we would figure out the paternity of the first baby and come back, and usually with frozen embryos, transfer a frozen embryo into another surrogate or the same surrogate, and they would then have a child. Now, I've also had couples where one of them has a sister who's the egg donor, and so in those situations, we would only use sperm from the other man and not brother-sister babies. That's no good. And I've had one situation where one man had a sister who provided the eggs, and the other man had a sister who was a surrogate, and so it was an all-in-the-family type of procedure. So there are many different types of scenarios that I've experienced. More recently, things have changed slightly. A few things have led to that. One of them is the trend towards transferring one embryo instead of more than one embryo. And so the other thing is the arrival of pre-implantation genetic testing technology, and with that, we generally don't need to transfer more than one embryo. Most of the time, we're successful with just transferring one embryo if the embryos are tested for chromosomes, and then we just transfer one embryo. So the vast majority of my cases currently are couples where they find an egg donor, we create the embryos are tested for the chromosomes and then frozen, and once the embryos are frozen, they then find a surrogate to come in, and we will transfer an embryo into the surrogate, and that's how they would get pregnant. Most of the time, what's happening is that we would create two cohorts if they both want to be genetic fathers, and we will transfer one embryo from one of them first, and then they'll come back and transfer one embryo from the other. There are a few cases where they still want to transfer one embryo from each, and they want to have twins. And if that's what they insist on doing, we will do that. We don't recommend it because twin pregnancies are generally more high risk. There's a higher risk of miscarriage. There's a higher risk of complications during the pregnancy, the higher risk of premature labor, preterm birth. And so those are some of the things that can happen with twin pregnancies, and that's one of the reasons why there's been a trend towards transferring just one embryo and having a singleton pregnancy each time. So that's just a very quick overview of the treatments that I provide from the medical perspective. I would be very happy to answer any questions that anybody has about the process and the procedures. I want to make this limited time that we have for me to give you information that you want to hear and not what I have to tell you. Go ahead. Can somebody get him a mic?
I have two questions.
Yes.
Is it, I heard it's like the mother side of DNA to determine the intelligence of the child. I want to know that's true. People say that. Second question is like, so what's the element of that when you find the egg donor, what you see from the egg donor, what you try to find element that creates.
Sure. Sure. Intelligence depends on a lot of things. Yes, there's some genetic predisposition. However, the environment that the child is raised in is also very, very important. And then, of course, you can have eggs from a very, very intelligent egg donor, but still have a child, if something goes wrong with the pregnancy, or if you have a twin pregnancy that delivers it prematurely at 26 weeks and the babies end up in neonatal intensive care unit, they could end up with brain damage, and so environmental influences can influence that. But yes, most of the time people are just looking for an egg donor who is healthy and has a reasonably decent family history, sometimes people want to find an egg donor who's educated, because that at least reflects that she may not be super intelligent, but she's an educated person. I think it really is important that each intended parent decide for themselves what is important for them. So when my husband and I were looking for an egg donor, my husband is American, and so we specifically were looking for an egg donor who was half Caucasian and half Chinese, so that both of our children would be biracial. That was one of the things that we were looking for. I wasn't as concerned about intelligence, but my husband was, and so we kept looking until we found somebody who was a graduate student. We have two lovely sons, 13 and 9, almost 10, and they're intelligent, but it's also the nurturing that we give to them as parents, and the school environment and what we have to provide them as parents that will nurture their education and growth. So it's not just intelligence. It's not just genetics, should I say. I don't know if I answered your question. Was that good enough? Not just from mom, no. It comes from both sides. Comes from both sides, and it comes from the nurturing environment that the parents have to provide the child. Other questions? I was here to talk about the medical aspects. I wasn't expecting that. Is there a translator that can translate?
不好意思，我想问一下，我现在是51岁，但是我有做了一个受精卵，在其他公司做的。然后呢，对方女的提供卵子是28岁左右，受精卵现在做了10几个，但是做了3次植入女方的子宫都不成功。我也做过筛查，但是做3次都失败了。这个为什么成功率那么低呢？
So is somebody going to translate that for me? I caught some of it.
就是说，我现在已经有做了受精卵，做了受精卵，但是我植入女方的子宫，
an embryo, and the egg donor was 28-year-old, and there had been 3 attempts, but it has never been successful.
Okay.
So why is the success rate so low?
Okay. So there are many, many different things that go into success rates with IVF. Only one of which is the age of the egg donor. We know that that is probably the most important determinant of success. However, there are other factors that go into it, not the least of which is the experience and the quality of the IVF center and the embryology lab, because that, clearly that has a significant influence on how the embryos develop and whether or not the process is successful. And then there's also embryo transfer techniques. There's also, the preparation of the uterus of the surrogate when we transfer the embryos. So like I say, there are multiple different factors that go into the likelihood of success. I'm not sure if I answered his questions. Is this for me? Oops. Okay. Okay.
I just want to check how current are the health profile for the egg donors, because there are some diseases that might go undetected, like HIV maybe a few months later when the blood test only they can detect is HIV positive. So how current are the health profile of the egg donors?
Right. The health profile in terms of the information that the egg donor provides is updated when she comes in. And then also, in terms of the testing, we update the tests when she's getting ready to do the IVF procedure. So in the US, there are actually very strict regulations by the FDA that requires that within 30 days of the egg donor providing the eggs, she has to be tested for a standard panel of infectious diseases, including HIV. And the panel of tests that we do includes the testing of for HIV. And so it's very current, and we usually do it within a week of the egg donor going to the egg retrieval. And we have to document that she's negative for all of these infectious diseases before we proceed. And if any of the tests are positive, then everything comes to a halt and she's canceled. For infectious diseases, that's the case. Now, in terms of family history and genetic history, what the egg donors do is they fill out a very detailed profile, and when they come in, when I interview them, I will go through that with them and query them about whether or not there's any new information or additional information. And in addition to that, what we always request of them, although that's voluntary, is that if they ever get new information, that they share it with us. And so sometimes we have an egg donor who will, say a year later and say, oh, my brother or my mother or whatever was just diagnosed with such and such a disease that I wasn't aware of when I was an egg donor. And so we sometimes will get information from the egg donor in that way as well, but that's after the fact, usually. Did that answer your questions? Other questions on the medical aspects of doing IVF and how we do it? Yes? A microphone there for him, please.
Due to the genotyping of the embryos, for example, you have known genetic mutations and screening?
Yes. So what we do now currently is that there are diseases that are referred to as autosomal recessive genetic disease. And autosomal recessive means that in order for a child to have that disease, both parents have to be carriers for the same genetic disease. And there are over 280 different autosomal recessive genetic diseases that exist. And so when intended parents come in, we screen them. And when the egg donor comes in, we screen them as well. We want to make sure that they're both not carriers for the same autosomal recessive genetic disease. And so if they are, we would generally recommend that they pick a different egg donor. That's more challenging if we have a husband and wife who are both carriers for the same disease. We can, you don't just pick a different husband and wife as easily as you pick a different egg donor. But for a husband and wife team, there is pre-implantation genetic testing of the embryo that we can do to try and not transfer any embryos that are going to have that disease. For egg donor situations, it's much easier because if you're both carriers for the same genetic disease, we just recommend that you pick a different egg donor. That's what we do is we test the embryos if both parents are carriers for the same genetic disease, or if a parent is a carrier for a specific disease that is not an autosomal recessive genetic disease, we can also test for that. And on top of that, when we do the chromosome testing, we can test to make sure that the embryo has the correct number of chromosomes. 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs and not extra chromosomes or missing chromosomes. And the ones that we're concerned about are the ones with the extra chromosome 21 that could lead to something called Down syndrome, for example. So yes, we can test the embryos for that, but that is something that the intended parents have to say, I want to do that. It is something that we are doing very commonly now. Other questions about the medical aspects? No, the extra chromosome testing is fees that we pay to a genetics lab that does the chromosome testing. So that will be extra cost because it's a fee that's paid to the genetics lab. And the cost depends on the number of embryos tested. Times? Okay. I think I'm out of time. I'm sorry. Whoops. Get it.